which is on migration and its discontents. This session will be chaired by Dr. Rajat Kathuria, who is the Director and Chief Executive, ICRIER. On the panel, we have Axel Berger, who is a researcher at the German Development Institute, S. Irudaya Rajan, who is a professor at the Center for Development Studies, and Sher Singh Verik, who is a Deputy Director, Decent Work Team for South Asia and Country Office, India, ILO. Over to you, Dr. Kathuria.
Thank you, Pratik, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the last session of this, what I think has been a fascinating conference since it kicked off yesterday morning. And I think we've saved the most contentious issue, or one of the most contentious issues, for the last. It's come up in the discussion, especially in the previous session, and it also came up for discussion in the inaugural session. And it is, as you know, that migration has so many facets, and increasingly they're coming out into the open and coming to the fore. Somebody mentioned in the previous session that trade is often seen as a substitute for trade. Trade in goods is seen as a substitute for trade in factors of production. That's the old Heckscher-Ohlin sort of framework where you don't need to liberalize. If you had liberalized trade in goods and markets were friction-free, that's also a fictional world. If markets were friction-free, then you'd get factor price equalization across the world. But as we know, that doesn't happen. And in terms of freeing up factor markets, we've had relatively much more success in freeing up capital markets than freeing labor markets. And as you heard in the previous session, even freeing up capital markets is proving to be quite contentious, especially for India, because, as you heard, freeing up capital, apart from the fact that it causes short-term volatility in prices at home, it also results in intrusion, or there's a perception that it would result in intrusion into domestic policy. So migration will also acquire other dimensions, and I think climate comes to mind immediately when you think about migration, and that's going to happen in the future as well, apart from all other aspects that continue to occur in the world today, such as, of course, refugees, and then migration for jobs, which continues. So, and climate is going to become another factor. And overlaying all of this, of course, is automation and how that is going to have an impact on the labor market and jobs. So these are difficult times, and as I said, this is a contentious issue. The role that the G20 can play, of course, is something that some of the panelists will discuss. Axel will discuss it from the perspective of the German presidency, what they've done. He wears the hat of a T20 think tank within the G20 process, and what role they've played, the German presidency has played in this issue of migration. But we'll kick off with Professor Rajan from the Center of Development Studies, and then Sher, and then finally we'll go to Axel in that order, if that's okay. So Professor Rajan, and since this is the last session, we could be a little flexible with time. So you could take 15 to 20 minutes if you like, but see how it goes. Thanks.
Thanks, Rajat, for the introduction as well as for the invitation to be here. I'm very pleased to be here, and what I will do, I will be spending some time, probably, as you said, maybe 15 to 20 minutes, to talk about G20 and migration. I think this is also, to bring the notice that the people are very shy to talk about migration, especially the policymakers, and of course, the politician has taken over, like Donald Trump. We are started, it is slowly moving from academics to politicians. And what I want to focus is that this also has something to do with the demographic imbalance in countries. I think we are not discussing much on that, which I will also get you some more detail on that. If you look at G20, we have some basics. 2/3 of the world population lives in G20, and 85% cross world product and 80% world trade. But on migration, you have 55% of the world migrants live in G20 countries. They do live. And 4/5 of the remittances flows also between these G20 countries and, of course, India, China, Mexico are the top 3 countries with what we call them the highest remittances received from workers. As I said earlier, when you talk about migration, we should also talk about demographic imbalance, because there are countries like India, we have a large young population. There are countries we have an aging population. Added to that, migration also affected by the economic growth rates. The country which is doing well, probably they don't discuss much on migration. When there is a depression, when there is a global crisis, people talk about their own country's employment, and they do talk about people coming and taking our jobs. I think this is something happens when the country is not doing well. Economically, we had that in the 2008 global crisis, where UAE people were leaving from the Gulf. Both Saudi Arabia and Qatar were able to attract more people because they are growing 2-digit economic growth rate. I think this is also something to keep in mind when you talk about migration. Both demography and the economy plays a major role. Now, if you look at the migration in the G20 countries, we have countries like Saudi Arabia. You have 1/3 of the population is basically migrants. If you see 3 people in Saudi Arabia, and of course now they are leading another crisis which we are talking about in Qatar now already, 1/3 of them are migrants. And you can look at Australia and Canada. They have, out of 5, you have 1 is a migrant. But there are at least 7 countries in the G20 have 1 out of 10 are migrants. That means some countries do depend on migrants for their activity. And as I said earlier, Saudi Arabia, Canada, Australia, about 20% of its population is migrants, 1 out of 5%, and the highest is reported in Saudi Arabia. And 7 countries in the G20, 1 out of 10% are migrants. And of course, depend upon, it changes between time to time, depend upon the policies, program. Many countries talk too much about people coming in, but they never talk about people going out. I think this is also we should keep in mind, because there are 2 aspects to migration. One is immigration. There are a lot of policies in many countries. They have a lot of restriction on visas. But then there are, when you talk about people going out of our country, we never discuss much on that. So we discuss, we protect people don't want to come in, but we don't talk about people going out. I think there is something we should talk about policies, maybe in the final discussion. And what the G20 is doing on migration. They had a meeting in 2015, and they committed to strengthen the policy measures to protect refugees and to tackle the causes of displacement. They were talking about refugees and displacement, but of course now the US is doing something on refugees, which I'll come back. And G20 in 2016 also reiterated this commitment. Like they would like to protect both the refugees and the people who are displaced by what Rakesh said about climate change or some other related natural disasters. But beyond remittances, G20 meetings have not focused much. I think this is where we should more debate on that, how to maximize the benefit of migration for growth and development. We are not talking migration for growth and development. When you talk about even sustainable development goals, I think people are now starting talking about migration role. And it also impacts both countries of origin and countries of destination. You should not look at only one side. Many times we talk about only one side. When I went for a meeting in the UAE, one of the workers said in Dubai, when I come 20 years back to Dubai, it's only sand and sand and sand alone. Today you see all the buildings were built by us, South Asians. So the contribution of the migrants at the countries of destination also to be documented, which we never talk about that. And G20 countries have not yet to agree on a broader strategy on how first to manage migration. I think managing migration should be an important part and parcel of countries. I think we should also talk about how G20 can look at it, to manage migration in the broader context. I'm going to spend some time on public perception on migration in the G20 because this also lead to political voting behavior, because these are all important, because the voting behavior to select a president or a prime minister or some countries which you talk about Brexit and other things, when you look at this, all the new development, we should also talk about what the public perceive, because that are converted into votes and that are converted into, they are seeing it, which you see right now, the election results coming out from UK, you can see that things are changing year by year, and that's where the perception is converted into votes when there is an elections. Now, attitude towards immigration in G20 countries, mostly mixed based on the world poll conducted by Gallup group, that 2012 to 14, and on average, every fifth person in the G20 wants immigration to stay at the present level. They don't want either increase or decrease. This is very important because people believe that immigrants are coming in, they are not able to integrate well with Europe, they are not like when people are, the perception is going up, and there is an implication whenever there is a referendum or an election, people do talk about that. And 1/5 of the person wants it to increase. That means there are people who want to increase migration, even the policymakers. And many policymakers, when we discuss, they all discuss about migration. People should come into their country outside the table, but when inside the parliament or inside, they don't talk about much because they know that migration is important. I think these are the things we should talk about in the public perception. That's why we are very shy always to talk about migration, including the SAARC countries framework, like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. When they talk about SAARC regional framework, they never discuss about migration because they tell us, whenever we ask them, we are all competitors in the Gulf countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, how we can talk about migration? That is why that's also taken granted by the other countries. Then they will, create competition between the sending countries and receiving countries. I think these are all things one should look at it. And this is a map on the public perception. I would like to get on attitudes. This also talk about, for example, if you talk to the younger persons, which are the first-time voters, which they voted power to in many times, including the last election in India, people who are the youth, what we call them 18 to 24, if they think that migration is not good for us, I think that will be translated into things. For example, India, we are talking about employment generation by the manifesto of the BJP. So people talk about employment. Good days are coming if you vote to power because we will provide employment, finance. So people, the attitudes is converted into things, and you look at that, people who are young, who are trying to get into the employment market, they think there is a competition for the other people, and they talk about it should be decreased. This also talks about by education, educated people. Sometimes, mid-educated people, they also think migrants are coming and taking our job. There's a competition. They are bringing down wages because we don't have enough information for people to convince migration is good or bad. Sometimes people are taken by the perception. This is also true with education. You can also look at that about that with the country's economy. If the economy is doing well, I don't think people worry too much about migration. They are not talking, okay, we are doing well. Let people also come and enjoy the benefits, what we have. But when you have tide, when you have depression, when your country is growing negatively like UAE in 2008, then people do talk about migration. I think you can look at that. Country's economy getting worse, 49% want to decrease migration. We are not doing well. Why the other people are coming in, taking even the limited jobs what we have? That's also important, the country's condition economic-wise. And also, this is also true with standard of living. And again, you have people who are native born, and you also have first generation migrants in many countries like US, in fact, even in the Gulf, they don't give PR, but still you have second generation migrants who are born in Saudi Arabia, UAE, and they were grown up there. So you have second generation migrants even in Gulf, but you can imagine second and third generation migrants in many countries in the G20 like Canada, Australia, US. So they also have some views on migration. For example, second generation migrants, for example, look at the native born think sometimes it should be decreased. Because they also think that, because they are already people have come. And let me take a big example of US for a few minutes. Look at the US. Immigrant as percentage of the US population, you can talk about last 100 years. We have reasonably a good database. Immigrants includes current migrants as well as the diasporas, because there are many are holding Indo-American, Indian, some of them hold Indian passports, some of them already moved to America, they have American passports. So you can look at that. There is there was a decline, there was an increase. You can see there is but after 1979, when they started talking about skilled migration, They want to attract high-skilled migration. We sometimes migrants, we talk about cherry picking. They pick up what they want. Maybe we want doctors, we want engineers, but not the unskilled migrants. That also lead to a lot of undocumented migrants coming up in many countries, because this we talk about Mexican case, because you are looking at skilled migrant attraction, then people who need unskilled, they are all coming through the other routes, what we call them undocumented. They come with a passport or a visa, they never go back. And this also something to do with your GDP growth rate of US. You see the growth rate is not very normal. You can see the growth rate. When you look at the growth rates of the economy and the migration, there should be some link, you can look at it. And that I would like people to look at it very carefully. How the economy is doing well, what is the people's perception and the policies on migration. And this is, again, US, you look at that US by continents. This is something people can look at it. You can look at it, some countries are going more to US, but not many countries. And if you look at some countries, and Mexico comes up as number one. So Mexico, that's why we always talk about Mexican border, and even the earlier election, before the election, Donald Trump said, if I come back to power, I'll construct a wall between USA and Mexico to stop migration. Of course, this also we had, even in the India's Assam elections, if you come back to power, we'll construct a wall between India and Bangladesh. I think, so because we cannot tell we'll construct a wall in Mexico and US, we can only tell we'll do in India and Bangladesh. So I think we also have some type of politics coming into the migration, because we think that there are a lot of undocumented migrants to our countries. And when you talk about undocumented migrants, I think this is a very, 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 very hot people don't want to talk about, because even in the Gulf, you have 20 to 30% South Asians are undocumented. Of course, nobody goes as undocumented, because people go on visit visas. They stay there. People go on yearly visa, and they are not able to make the money. We met several people for our studies where they say that, look, we paid money and came to Gulf, 1 lakh, 2 lakhs, and we have been cheated. So it is what we call them sometimes. We are creating what I call them sometimes new form of slavery in the Gulf countries, because they have nothing. Their passports are not there, and they are all waiting for amnesty. And it's going to come up now very, very, very soon in Saudi Arabia, because they know that people have come in there, because people are coming and they need workers. But that policies, when you protect people not to enter in, they use all other ways to get into the country through whatever way, and then they stay there. I think this is something important, and that people talk about US, Mexico, undocumented migrants, and also people talk about crimes. Crimes are created by migrants. This I hear even in Kerala. We have now 25 lakhs people coming from all parts of India to Kerala, because Kerala is an aging population. Our TFR is just 1.2. So we need people within the country, but we have a lot of people coming into Kerala to just get jobs because of the higher wages, because a plumber can get 120 rupees in Rajasthan, he can get 850 rupees in Kerala. So he is coming in. But and then we talk about crimes. And people talk about health. Health secretary talking to us, saying that, look, many diseases have been eradicated from Kerala. Now it is coming back through migrants. So, enroll them. Like we are all looking at them like undocumented crimes and walls between India and Bangladesh, we already discussed. And then, after the Donald Trump took over, we talk about travel ban for seven countries, which you can see that. And if you look at that, these 7 countries, these 7 countries include all these, basically these are all Muslim countries: Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Syria, and Yemen. Now these countries, there was a travel ban, and look at their refugees. And they said all entries for 90 days has been stopped, and 120 days, no refugee can come into the US. And G20 talks about strengthening refugee movements and helping them out. But you see, there's a country, you can see that they want to 120 days, there will be no refugees should come into the US, and then of course, nobody from Syria. So I think policies on refugees also, we should look at it. Of course, India also have refugees. We don't have any policy on that. Of course, India has no policy on even migration. We have policy on many things, and that's why we always talk about we have agricultural policy, industrial policy, but we have no migration policy in this country. We have only small policy on interstate migration. And finally, it also talks about quality of migrants. I think these people don't talk about that. We talk about, now there is a big program on Skill India. Quality of migrants in the US, for example, look at 73% of the Indian migrants there. That's what someone saying, they are just 1% in America, but they are getting highest salaries. That's also create competitions. I think this is also, now Skill India program in India with a high demographic dividend. I think these people is likely to move, and they're already started opening skill centers. So automatically the skill requirement, because everybody talks about skilled migration, nobody talk about unskilled migration, because one skilled migrant will produce two unskilled jobs. If somebody is going to US and he needs a driver and a housemaid, you are not providing them, and they have to get through some sources to have a housemaid, which is easily you can get in, for example, in Delhi. So I think we never discuss about skilled migrants when you want. They also need unskilled migrants to support their work. We are not talking about, that's why many countries, including Europe, they talk about blue card, but I don't think how successful the blue cards are, we have to look at it. I think people are talking about migration, but they are not doing really well. And then the student migration. This is something people do talk about that. Student migration, because I always tell current students to all the countries in UK are future laborers. They come here and recruit students. It's like the Dubai fellow come and recruit laborers. America and UK come here and with the festival they recruit students. So you are recruiting today's students, and most of them are pest students, and they never return. Many of them goes to US, UK, Canada, and of course they are now trying to send them back, which is the policy which is coming up in UK. So I think there are different yardsticks we should look at it for migration. And final slide is that I think we should look at different facets of the migration, the G20. One is the student migration, because some of them are attractive. For example, Australia, we got a lot of difficulty in student migration. Then people started moving to UK. Then UK created some problem for them. Then now Australia is picking up. So you can see that student migration, something which is G20. And of course, student migration people are talking much because they are, as I said earlier, future laborers for them. And they are trained here. All the best students from India will leave, and they never come back. We have to look for them. We call them people of Indian origin, and then we tell them that please come back and do industries. How much they are coming back, return migrants, and produce their skills back to their own country. We have a big question mark on that, because we are not getting in. In fact, Chinese are having a lot of policies to bring return migrants to come back and spend some time. And then there is a separate policies for skilled migration. We should look at it, what we are doing in the G20. And then you have a very, very, the way you look at undocumented is something like very, very, very dirty. I think this has to change your mind, because no one can enter to any country today without a proper visa unless you go through sea routes, which even, I was talking to some of the people in Kerala, 40 years back, many Malayalis used to take a boat from Kerala to go to Dubai without any passport. What you are seeing in Turkey or in some other countries. Today, people have moved undocumented between Kerala to Gulf, but now nobody goes. I think, so people are coming documented into your country, and you are making undocumented. This is what I tell them many times in the Gulf countries. Nobody comes undocumented. You cannot get down in UAE or Dubai or Abu Dhabi or Sharjah without a proper passport. Now they tell me there are 2 lakhs Indians without proper documents. Where are they come from? I think you are making them undocumented by your false policies in your countries of destination. I think this is something we should remind them by the countries of origin. Nobody comes in. Refugees, this is, it's not they are coming because they have a problem in their country. So we have to look at policies on each front separately in the G20, because you cannot put all of them in one basket. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rajan, for that passionate presentation. We'll come back to some of the questions at the end. Cher?
Right, thank you, Rajan, and thank you very much for this opportunity to speak on migration. It indeed is a very contentious issue. I don't have a PowerPoint, so which always gives me the advantage of being able to change what I want to say after listening to a speaker, so that gives me some flexibility. I think we're all very aware that migration has been on the rise in recent decades, increasing threefold by 1960. By 2013, there were around 232 million migrants in the world. Of those, 150 were migrant workers. Professor Rajan has already given you the stats for G20. 55% of all migrants are living in these countries. They account for 80% of the remittance flows. But of course, as he also showed you, there's considerable diversity within the G20 countries, right? You have countries like China and Indonesia, India, Mexico, Brazil, with negligible amounts of migrant workers. Of course, they're underreported given the lack of statistics. But then you have countries like Canada, Australia, and Saudi Arabia with much higher proportions of migrant workers. I think it's interesting to see how the flows have changed. In particular, south-north migration has grown strongly in recent decades. But also, if you look at the south-south flows, India to the Gulf, etc., remains very high. And in that context, and I'll refer to this a number of times, and for your information, the ILO, who I work for, is part of the G20 forum. We're one of the international organizations supporting the G20, particularly on the labor and employment track. So migration has come up there a number of times, as pointed out by Professor Rajan. But in our joint work with the OECD and the World Bank for the G20 meetings in 2015, we showed that, in terms of the south-south migration flows, the biggest contributor was from South Asia. Between 2000 and 2030, 30 million additional people from South Asia relocated outside their country of birth. So we really are in the center of the migration flows, south-south and south-north migration flows, which are really dominating the world. I think it's also very important to mention gender. Gender is a critical aspect of migration that has been changing. Of course, it also varies across sending countries and destination countries. ILO estimates indicate that around 45% of all migrants are now women. So that has gone up considerably over recent years. But if you look at domestic workers, we estimate there's around 11.5 million migrant domestic workers in the world. Of course, that is also an underestimate, but that's the best figure we have come up with. And out of that 11.5 million, around 74% are women. And a lot of them are ending up in Southeast Asia, that has the largest share of domestic workers, but also in other regions in the world. When I was thinking about today's session, of course, we see the G20 as a bloc. It's a political forum. But I thought it was also useful to reflect on the discontents, as pointed out by Raja, that it is a very contentious issue, and also to reflect on actually what has changed in recent years. Because I remember looking at the migration literature during my PhD, some coursework unit, and I was looking at back in 2000, and many of those issues still remain relevant. But nonetheless, there are also some trends that are worth reflecting on in terms of what is also driving change. But firstly, about what is perhaps still, features of migration that we've known for some time, for some decades. If you look at the drivers of migration, naturally the economic drivers remain very strong in terms of wage differentials, the lack of job opportunities in sending countries. Demographics, has been a long process of, in terms of aging in advanced economies and with excess labor supply in poorer countries pulling in those workers. The social drivers, colonial linkages, common languages, conflict, natural disasters, these are not new drivers, but have been there for decades and centuries, in fact. But really, when we talk about what's contentious, it's really about the impact of migration, right? And the literature has been there for a number of decades, which has looked at the impact of migration, particularly in advanced economies, and the political aspects of the impact of migration is not new. It has, of course, increased and become even more politicized, but this goes back many decades. And of course, there's always been a real concern about the economic impact of migrants on the receiving country's labor market. And, we economists use the terrible terms on the natives. I don't know, sometimes you wonder where economists come up with ways of describing the labor market. But, the concern has always been about the impact of migrants on natives in terms of their employment outcomes, but also in particular in terms of wages. And, there's a large literature that looks at the impact of migration, but, mostly rather small. But really the fundamental issue is whether migrant workers are going to be a substitute for the native workers or a complement. And, really the low-skilled workers are the ones who have suffered more. Fiscal impact is a big issue. Are migrant workers in advanced economies such as the G20 taking welfare? But the estimates there as well, I think OECD has got some estimates which suggest fiscal impact does vary across countries, but it tends to be small, around 0.5% of GDP. A second area that has been a concern for many decades is brain drain from developing countries, and we've seen that across the world with the doctors and nurses going from West Africa to the UK, etc. That has been there for a number of decades. But even going back to the early 2000s, there was recognition that brain drain can turn into brain circulation if the right policies are in place. And of course, you know, India and China are great examples of that. But, you know, in addition to the brain circulation, the remittance flows have been critical, going from advanced economies to the sending economies. And really, there's been a, you know, very strong recognition of the positive role remittances have played in terms of both macroeconomic and microeconomic impacts, you know. And you've seen a really very important, you know, reduction in poverty happening through remittances. You look at Nepal, you know, plays a very big role. Though it does also create macroeconomic